The mountain man's axe came down with such force that the pine tree shuddered from roots to crown, and when it finally crashed to the forest floor, the sound echoed through the Colorado Rockies like thunder in 1876. Jacob Thornwood stood 6 feet 4 inches tall with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world, his dark hair falling past his collar in waves that caught the morning sunlight. His arms, thick with muscle from years of solitary labor, glistened with sweat as he surveyed the fallen timber. He had been building his cabin alone for 3 months now, every beam hewn by his own hands, every corner squared by his own eye. The work was back-breaking and endless, but Jacob preferred it that way. Alone on this mountain, he answered to no one, spoke to no one, and felt nothing but the satisfying ache of exhausted muscles at day's end. He had come to these mountains 2 years ago, running from memories of the war that still woke him in cold sweats. The Battle of Little Bighorn had happened just months ago, but Jacob had left the cavalry long before that, unable to stomach any more death. He had drifted west from Kansas, seeking silence and solitude, and found both in these towering peaks. Now, at 28 years old, he was building something permanent for the first time in his adult life. A home, a place to weather the coming winter and all the winters after that. Jacob wiped his brow with the back of his hand and bent to strip the branches from the felled tree. His knife worked with practiced efficiency, shaving away bark and cutting notches for joints. By midday, he would have another beam ready to raise. The cabin was taking shape slowly but surely. 3 walls stood already, each log fitted so tightly that no chinking would be needed. The 4th wall and the roof remained, and Jacob figured another month would see it finished. Then he could build furniture, lay in supplies for winter, maybe even construct a small barn for the horse he planned to buy in the spring. The sound of hoofbeats on the mountain trail made Jacob's head snap up. His hand instinctively moved to the rifle leaning against a nearby stump. Visitors were rare this far into the wilderness, and in his experience, unexpected company usually meant trouble. He straightened to his full height, presenting an imposing figure as a single horse picked its way through the pines toward his clearing. The rider was a woman, and that fact alone surprised him enough that his grip on the rifle loosened slightly. She sat astride a gray mare, her dark blue traveling dress dusty from the trail and her bonnet hanging down her back by its ribbons. Auburn hair escaped from pins that had clearly given up their fight hours ago, and even from a distance, Jacob could see the exhaustion in the set of her shoulders. She spotted him and pulled the mare to a halt at the edge of his clearing, her green eyes taking in his massive frame and the half-built cabin behind him. "I am looking for Jacob Thornwood," she said, her voice carrying a cultured Eastern accent that seemed wildly out of place among the pines. "I was told in Denver that he might be found in these mountains." Jacob's jaw tightened. No one should know his name. He had left that name behind with his uniform and his past. "Who is asking?" The woman swayed slightly in her saddle, and Jacob realized she was close to collapse. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her face was pale beneath a layer of trail dust. "My name is Eleanor Hartwell. I have traveled from Boston. I need to speak with you about a matter of great importance. Please." The last word came out as barely a whisper, and then Eleanor Hartwell from Boston slid sideways off her horse and crumpled to the ground in a dead faint. Jacob cursed under his breath and strode across the clearing. He knelt beside the unconscious woman, noting the rapid flutter of her pulse at her throat and the way her lips had gone bloodless. Heat exhaustion, probably, combined with hunger and fatigue. He scooped her up easily, her weight nothing compared to the logs he had been lifting all morning, and carried her to the shade of his tent. He laid her on his bedroll and went to fetch water and a cloth. When he returned, Eleanor's eyes were open, staring up at the canvas above her with confusion. She turned her head as he approached and tried to sit up. "I apologize. I have been traveling for 3 days without proper rest. The urgency of my mission made me foolish." "Drink this." Jacob pressed his canteen into her hands. "Slowly." She obeyed, taking small sips while her eyes studied him over the rim of the canteen. Up close, he could see that she was probably in her middle 20s, with fine features and intelligent eyes. Her traveling dress, though dusty, was well-made and expensive. Money, then, and education. The kind of woman who had no business being alone in these mountains. "How did you find me?" Jacob asked, settling back on his heels. "And why?" Eleanor lowered the canteen and took a shaky breath. Your brother gave me your location, Thomas Thornwood. He said you were the only one who could help me. The name hit Jacob like a physical blow. Thomas. His younger brother still living in Kansas, still working the family farm that Jacob had abandoned. They had not spoken in over a year. Thomas should not be telling strangers where to find me, and I cannot imagine what help you think I can provide. I need you to build something, Eleanor said, struggling to sit up fully. Jacob put a hand on her shoulder to steady her, and she flinched at the contact before relaxing. I need you to build a school. Jacob stared at her. A school. Yes, in a town called Silver Ridge, about 20 miles south of here. I've been hired as the school teacher, but when I arrived last week, I discovered that the building burned down 3 months ago and has not been rebuilt. The town council claims they lack the funds and the manpower to construct a new one. Your brother told me you were a master carpenter before the war and that you built half the barns in Douglas County. He said if anyone could raise a building quickly and well, it was you. Thomas talks too much, Jacob muttered. I am not a carpenter anymore. I'm a mountain man, and I prefer to keep to myself. You wasted a trip, Miss Hartwell. Eleanor's green eyes flashed with sudden fire. I did not travel 2,000 miles to be dismissed so easily, Mr. Thornwood. The children of Silver Ridge deserve an education. They deserve a proper building where they can learn and grow. I have funding from a benefactor in Boston to pay for materials and labor. All I need is someone with the skill and the strength to do the work. Your brother assured me you were that man. My brother was wrong. Jacob stood and walked to the edge of the tent, looking out at his half-finished cabin. I am busy with my own building. I have no interest in coming down off this mountain to work in a town full of people. I can pay you well, very well. I do not need money. Everyone needs money, Mr. Thornwood. Jacob turned to face her, his expression hard. I came up here to be alone, to escape people and their problems and their wars. I'm not coming back down. Find someone else. Eleanor pushed herself to her feet, swaying slightly but lifting her chin with stubborn determination. There is no one else. The men in Silver Ridge are either prospectors who lack the skill or ranch hands who lack the time. You are my only hope. Those children are my only hope. Then I am sorry for you and for them, but the answer is still no. They stood facing each other in the shade of the tent, two wills colliding. Eleanor's exhaustion was evident in every line of her body, but her eyes burned with a passion that Jacob found unsettling. He had spent 2 years cultivating numbness, carefully building walls around his heart as sturdy as the walls of his cabin. This woman, with her Eastern accent and her impossible mission, threatened to breach those walls, and he would not allow it. Will you at least let me rest here for the night? Eleanor asked finally, her voice quieter. I'm not sure I can make it back to Silver Ridge before dark, and I would rather not spend the night alone on the trail. Jacob wanted to refuse. He wanted to send her away immediately, to restore his solitude before she could complicate his life further. But he had been raised with certain principles, and one of them was that you did not send a woman out into the wilderness alone when darkness was coming. He nodded curtly. You can have the tent. I will sleep under the stars, but at first light, you leave. Thank you. Eleanor sank back down onto the bedroll, and within minutes, she was asleep again. Jacob stood watching her for a moment, noting the way exhaustion had smoothed the determination from her face, leaving her looking younger and more vulnerable. Then he turned away and went back to work on his cabin, attacking the logs with renewed vigor, trying to work off the strange restlessness that Eleanor Hartwell's arrival had stirred in his chest. By evening, Jacob had another beam ready and had begun notching the logs for the fourth wall. He worked until the light failed, then built up the fire and set about making supper. He had fresh trout from the stream and wild onions he had gathered earlier in the week. He cooked them in his iron skillet along with cornmeal cakes, and the smell brought Eleanor stumbling from the tent, her hair loose around her shoulders and her eyes still heavy with sleep. I'm sorry, she said, pressing her hands to her cheeks. I meant to help with the meal. You must think me terribly rude. I think you were exhausted, Jacob said, handing her a tin plate filled with food. Sit and eat. They ate in silence for a while, the crackling of the fire and the distant call of an owl the only sounds. Jacob was acutely aware of Eleanor's presence across the fire from him, the way the flames painted gold highlights in her auburn hair and cast shadows across her face. He tried to remember the last time he had shared a meal with another person and could not. "Your brother spoke very highly of you," Eleanor said eventually. "He said you were the finest man he knew, despite your determination to hide from the world. Thomas has always been prone to exaggeration. He said you saved his life during the war, that you carried him 15 miles with a bullet in your own leg to get him to a field hospital." Jacob's jaw tightened. That was a long time ago. "He said you have been punishing yourself ever since for surviving when so many others did not, that you came up here to this mountain to die slowly of loneliness rather than quickly of a bullet. Thomas should learn to keep family business private." Jacob set his plate down with more force than necessary. "I did not come here to die. I came here to live on my own terms, away from people and their judgments and their endless demands." "Is it truly living, though?" Eleanor asked softly. "Or is it just existing?" Jacob stood abruptly, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You know nothing about me or my life. You show up uninvited, asking for favors, making assumptions. I offered you hospitality for one night. I did not offer you the right to question my choices." Eleanor rose as well, her eyes meeting his steadily despite the foot of height difference between them. "You are right. I apologize. I have overstepped. But I will tell you one thing before I leave tomorrow. Those children in Silver Ridge look at me with such hope in their eyes. They hunger for knowledge, for opportunity, for a chance at a better life than their parents had. And I can give that to them, but only if I have a school to teach in. I cannot do it alone. I need help. I need your help." "The answer is still no." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Then I will bid you good night, Mr. Thornwood. Thank you for the meal and for the shelter." She turned and walked back to the tent, her spine straight despite her obvious disappointment. Jacob watched her go, then stalked off into the darkness, needing to put distance between himself and the accusation in her green eyes. He walked through the forest until his anger cooled, then stood at the edge of a cliff looking out over the moonlit valleys below. The mountains stretched away in all directions, vast and empty and indifferent. He had found peace in that indifference, or so he had told himself, but Eleanor's words echoed in his mind. Was it truly living, or just existing? He returned to camp hours later to find the fire banked and the camp silent. He spread his blanket on the ground near the dying coals and tried to sleep, but his dreams were troubled by the faces of children he had never met, looking at him with hopeful eyes. Dawn came cold and clear. Jacob rose before the sun and rekindled the fire, then set coffee to boil. Eleanor emerged from the tent as the first rays of sunlight touched the peaks above them, her hair neatly pinned and her bonnet in place. She had cleaned the trail dust from her face, and in the fresh morning light, Jacob could see the true beauty that exhaustion had masked the day before. She was lovely, with porcelain skin and a generous mouth that looked made for smiling, though it was set in serious lines now. "I will make breakfast before you go," Jacob said gruffly. "That is kind of you." Eleanor accepted a cup of coffee and wrapped her hands around it, watching him cook with an expression he could not read. They ate quickly and in silence. When Eleanor had finished, she stood and brushed the crumbs from her skirt. "I should go. Thank you again for your hospitality, Mr. Thornwood. I'm sorry to have disturbed your solitude." Jacob nodded and watched as she walked to her horse and checked the saddle. She mounted with practiced ease, settling into the side saddle and gathering the reins. Then she turned the mare's head toward the trail and looked back at him one last time. "I meant what I said about those children," she said quietly. "They deserve better, and so do you." Then she clicked her tongue to the horse and rode away, disappearing into the trees without looking back. Jacob stood staring at the empty trail for a long time after she was gone. Then he cursed, grabbed his axe, and went back to work on the cabin. He drove himself hard all morning, trying to exhaust the strange restlessness that had taken up residence in his chest. But every time he paused to wipe sweat from his eyes, he found himself thinking about Eleanor's words, about children who deserved an education, about a woman who had traveled 2,000 miles to give them one. By noon, he had finished notching the logs for the fourth wall. He stood back surveying his work and realized with a start that raising the wall alone would be difficult, not impossible, but challenging. He had managed the first 3 walls through a combination of brute strength and clever use of ropes and pulleys. But he was growing tired. The work was wearing him down more than he wanted to admit. He thought about his cabin, about the quiet winter he had planned, about the life of solitude stretching endlessly ahead. Then he thought about Eleanor's eyes, blazing with determination and hope, about children hungry for knowledge, about a woman who could not do it alone, just as he could not raise this final wall alone without struggle. Jacob made his decision quickly, before he could think better of it. He gathered his tools, banked the fire, and saddled his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding he had bought from a rancher the previous year. He left most of his supplies secured in the tent, taking only what he would need for a few weeks in town. Then he mounted up and headed down the mountain toward Silver Ridge. The town was smaller than he had expected, just a main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, and a few other businesses scattered along its length. Houses and cabins dotted the hillsides above the town, and Jacob could see the dark mouths of mine shafts scarring the mountains beyond. Silver Ridge was a mining town then, probably founded in the rush after the war. The people on the street stopped to stare as he rode past, taking in his size and his rough mountain clothing with wary eyes. Jacob found Eleanor at the small boarding house at the end of the main street. She was sitting on the front porch with a book in her lap, but she looked up as he approached, and her eyes went wide with shock. "Mr. Thornwood, I did not expect to see you again." Jacob dismounted and tied his horse to the rail. "I thought about what you said, about those children deserving better, about not being able to do it alone." He climbed the steps and stood before her, his hat in his hands. "I will build your school, Miss Hartwell, but I have conditions." Eleanor set her book aside and rose to her feet, hope dawning in her eyes. "Name them." "I work alone. I do not need help from townspeople standing around giving advice. You can help if you want, but no one else. I will build it my way, solid and true, using timber from the mountains. It will be a good building, one that will stand for generations. But I will not compromise on quality to save time or money. And when it is done, I go back to my mountain. No tearful goodbyes, no requests to stay, no complications. Understood?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "Understood. Although I cannot promise not to help. I may not know carpentry, but I am stronger than I look, and I'm a quick learner." "Fine. Show me where the old school stood." Eleanor led him through town to a blackened lot on the eastern edge of the settlement. The ruins of the burned building had been cleared away, leaving only a stone foundation and a pile of debris. Jacob walked the perimeter, examining the foundation and testing the stones with his boot. It was solid work, laid deep enough to prevent frost heave. He could use it. "How many children do you expect to teach?" he asked. "I have been told to expect 30 to 40 students, ranging in age from 6 to 15. Jacob nodded, his mind already designing the building. "I will make it large enough for 50, with room to expand if needed. We will need a good wood stove for winter, large windows for light, and a peaked roof to shed snow. I can have it finished in 6 weeks if the weather holds." 6 weeks? Eleanor's face lit with joy. "Truly, the town council said it would take months." "The town council probably planned to work on it between their other obligations. I will work on it every day, dawn to dusk. But I will need materials, nails, windows, a stove, roofing materials. Can your benefactor provide them?" "Yes. I have funds available at the bank. Whatever you need, I can procure it." "Good. I will make a list. While we wait for materials to arrive, I will cut timber and prepare the beams. We start tomorrow." Over the next 2 weeks, Jacob fell into a new routine. He rose before dawn and rode into the mountains to fell trees, selecting straight pines and strong oaks for the frame. He would bring them back to town tied to his horse, then spend the afternoon stripping bark and hewing beams. Eleanor appeared every morning at sunrise, with breakfast in a basket, and stayed all day, watching him work with fascination and asking endless questions about carpentry and construction. At first, Jacob answered in monosyllables, uncomfortable with the conversation and with Eleanor's presence. But gradually, despite his best intentions, he found himself explaining his methods in more detail. He showed her how to read the grain of wood to determine its strength, how to cut notches so the joints would lock together without nails, how to use a level and a plumb line to ensure everything was square and true. Eleanor proved to be an apt student. She had hands that were soft from a life of privilege but willing to work. She held boards steady while he sawed, fetched tools when he needed them, and kept him supplied with cold water from the town well. They worked in companionable silence much of the time, but occasionally Eleanor would tell him about her life in Boston, about the prestigious girls' academy where she had been educated, about her decision to come west to teach. "My father was furious," she said one afternoon as they sat in the shade eating lunch. "He said I was throwing away my breeding and my prospects. But I could not spend another season attending parties and pretending to care about fashion and gossip. I wanted to do something meaningful with my life. I wanted to make a difference." "Why teaching?" Jacob asked, surprising himself with his curiosity. "My mother was a teacher before she married. She used to tell me that education was the greatest gift you could give a child, because it opened doors that would otherwise remain forever closed. She died when I was 12, and I think in some way I'm honoring her memory by following in her footsteps." Jacob was quiet for a moment. "She would be proud of you." Eleanor smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her face and made Jacob's chest tighten in an unfamiliar way. "Thank you. That means more than you know." The materials began arriving from Denver on the twice-weekly freight wagon. Windows in sturdy wooden frames, kegs of nails, rolls of tar paper for the roof, and a beautiful cast-iron stove with decorative scrollwork. Eleanor supervised the unloading and storage of everything, keeping meticulous records of costs and inventory in a leather-bound ledger. With the materials on hand, Jacob began the actual construction. He had Eleanor help him mark out the dimensions on the existing foundation. Then they started raising the frame. The first wall went up in a day, massive posts and beams fitted together with the precision of fine furniture. The second wall followed, then the third and fourth. Eleanor helped where she could, holding tools and fetching supplies, but mostly she watched Jacob work with open admiration. He was magnificent to watch, she thought, though she would never say so aloud. His muscles bunched and flexed beneath his shirt as he lifted beams that must have weighed hundreds of pounds. Sweat soaked his hair and made it curl against his neck. His hands, large and scarred, worked with a grace and precision that seemed impossible for their size. He moved with the confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, every motion economical and purposeful. But more than his physical strength, Eleanor was drawn to the quiet intensity she saw in his eyes when he worked. This was more than a job to him, she realized. This was craftsmanship, artistry even. He cared about every joint, every angle, every detail. He was building something meant to last, something beautiful and strong. Watching him work, Eleanor began to understand why he had retreated to the mountains. This level of focus and care could not exist amid the noise and rush of ordinary life. It required silence and solitude. Yet here he was, building in the midst of a town, for the benefit of children he did not know. Eleanor wondered what had changed his mind that morning after she left his camp. She had ridden away certain she would never see him again, had spent the entire journey back to Silver Ridge alternating between tears of frustration and prayers for a miracle. And then he had appeared on the boarding house porch like an answer to those prayers, gruff and uncomfortable, but committed to helping nonetheless. 3 weeks into the construction, the school had walls and a roof frame. Jacob was working on installing the roof boards when one of the townspeople finally worked up the courage to approach. It was a man in his 40s, weathered and lean, with the look of a prospector about him. "Name is Caleb Morrison," he said, squinting up at where Jacob was perched on the roof. "I wanted to thank you for building this school. My daughter Jenny is one of Miss Hartwell's students. This means the world to us." Jacob nodded acknowledgement and continued working. "I also wanted to apologize for the town council," Caleb continued. "We should have found a way to rebuild before Miss Hartwell arrived. We got so caught up in our own struggles that we forgot what was important." "Building is done now," Jacob said, "or will be soon enough. Still, we are grateful. If there is anything the town can do to repay you, nothing needed. Miss Hartwell is paying me for my labor." Caleb nodded and walked away, but after that, more townspeople began stopping by. They brought offerings of food and drink, thanked Jacob awkwardly, and hurried off as if afraid of disturbing him. Jacob accepted their thanks with curt nods, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, but Eleanor noticed that he was less harsh in his dismissals as the days went on. One evening, as they were packing up tools for the day, Eleanor asked, "Is it really so terrible being around people again?" Jacob was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. Then he said, "I got used to silence. to not having to talk or explain myself or meet expectations. Coming back down here reminds me of all the ways I can disappoint people." "You are not disappointing anyone," Eleanor said gently. "You are giving this town an incredible gift. I am building a building, nothing more. You are giving children hope. You are giving me a place to teach. That is considerably more than just a building." Jacob looked at her then, really looked at her, and Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks under his intense gaze. There was something in his dark eyes, some emotion she could not name, that made her heart beat faster. "You have a romantic view of things, Miss Hartwell," he said finally. "I suppose that comes from all those books you read." "And you have a cynical view of things, Mr. Thornwood. I suppose that comes from seeing too much war and death." The words hung between them for a moment, sharp and true. Then Jacob's mouth quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Perhaps we are both right." "Perhaps," Eleanor agreed softly. The next week brought challenges. A storm rolled in from the west, bringing driving rain that halted work for 2 days. Jacob spent the time at the boarding house, crafting desks and benches for the school in the landlady's barn. Eleanor joined him there, and they worked side by side in the dry shelter while rain drummed on the roof overhead. The enforced proximity made conversation unavoidable, and Eleanor found herself telling Jacob things she had never told anyone. About her lonely childhood as an only child in a household focused on social standing. About her love of books and learning and how it had set her apart from other girls her age. About the grief that still sometimes overwhelmed her when she thought of her mother. Jacob listened more than he spoke, but occasionally he would offer a comment or a question that showed he was truly hearing her. And sometimes, when the rain was particularly loud, he would tell her small pieces of his own story, about growing up on a Kansas farm with 3 younger siblings, about learning carpentry from his grandfather, a German immigrant who had built half the town, about the war and the things he had seen that he could never unsee. "I killed 17 men that I know of," he said one afternoon, his hands continuing to plane a board smooth even as he spoke. "Maybe more in battle when I could not see who fell from my bullets. I was following orders, doing what I was told was right and necessary. But at night, when I close my eyes, I see their faces. Young men, most of them, probably scared and far from home just like I was. And I wonder what gave me the right to end their lives." Eleanor's throat was tight with unshed tears. "You were a soldier in a war. You did what you had to do to survive. Survival does not feel like much of a justification when I think about their mothers and wives and children, all the people who lost someone because of me. And what about all the people who would have lost you if you had not fought? Your brother Thomas, for one. He would be dead now if you had not carried him to safety. How many other men did you save during your service?" "I do not know. I did not keep count of those." "Perhaps you should have." Eleanor set down the sandpaper she had been using and moved closer to him. "Jacob Thornwood, you are not a killer. You are a builder. Look at what you have created with these hands." She gestured around the barn at the beautiful desks and benches taking shape. "You build things that last, things that serve and shelter and bring beauty into the world. That is who you truly are. The war tried to make you something else, but it failed. You are still a builder." Jacob stopped working and looked at her. His dark eyes were troubled, but there was something else there too, something warm and vulnerable that made Eleanor's breath catch. "You see me differently than I see myself, Miss Hartwell." "Perhaps I see you more clearly," she whispered. They stood very close in the dim barn, the rain a curtain of sound around them. Jacob reached out slowly and tucked a strand of hair behind Eleanor's ear, his rough fingertips gentle against her temple. "You should not waste your clarity on a broken man. You are not broken. You are healing. There is a difference." Jacob's hand lingered near her face for a moment longer, then he stepped back and returned to his work. But something had shifted between them. Some wall had begun to crack. Eleanor returned to her sanding with a smile she could not quite suppress. When the weather cleared, they resumed work on the school with renewed energy. The roof went on, tight and true, shedding water like a duck's back. The windows were installed, their glass panes sparkling in the sunlight. Jacob hung a solid oak door with iron hinges he forged himself in the blacksmith's shop. Inside, they installed the stove and ran the chimney pipe through the roof. The desks and benches were brought from the barn and arranged in neat rows. Eleanor painted the walls white and hung curtains she had sewn herself in the windows. 5 weeks after Jacob had ridden down from his mountain, the school was finished. It stood solid and beautiful on its foundation, with a bell tower that Jacob had added as a surprise. The bell itself had been donated by the church, and its clear tone rang out across the town when Eleanor pulled the rope for the first time. The whole town turned out for the dedication ceremony. The minister said a prayer of thanksgiving, the mayor gave a speech praising Jacob's skill and dedication, and the children sang a song Eleanor had taught them. Jacob stood at the back of the crowd, uncomfortable with the attention, but Eleanor caught his eye and smiled, and he felt something warm unfurl in his chest. After the ceremony, there was a celebration with food and music. Jacob tried to slip away, but Eleanor caught his arm. "You cannot leave yet. You are the guest of honor." "I am no good at parties, Miss Hartwell. It is just neighbors celebrating something good, and you must stop calling me Miss Hartwell. After all these weeks working together, I think you can call me Eleanor." "Only if you call me Jacob." Eleanor smiled. "Done. Now, come and have some pie, Jacob. Mrs. Peterson made her famous apple pie, and I will not let you leave until you have tried it." Jacob allowed himself to be led to the food tables, where he was surrounded by grateful parents and excited children. He answered their questions with his usual brevity, but Eleanor noticed that he did not seem quite as uncomfortable as he had been at the beginning. Maybe, just maybe, he was remembering how to be part of a community again. As evening approached and the celebration wound down, Eleanor and Jacob found themselves alone in the new school. They stood together looking around at what they had built, both feeling the satisfaction of completed work and the strange melancholy that came with endings. "I suppose you will be heading back to your mountain now," Eleanor said quietly. "I suppose I will," Jacob agreed. "My cabin still needs finishing before winter." "Of course. You have already given so much time to this project, more than I had any right to ask." "You did not ask. You begged and shamed me into it," Jacob said, but there was warmth in his voice. Eleanor laughed. "True, and I'm not sorry for it. This school will change lives, Jacob. For generations to come, children will learn and grow within these walls you built. That matters. You matter." Jacob turned to face her fully. In the golden light of the setting sun streaming through the windows, Eleanor looked radiant. Her auburn hair glowed like fire, and her green eyes were bright with emotion. She was the most beautiful thing Jacob had ever seen, more beautiful than mountain sunrises or ancient forests or anything else in his experience. "Eleanor," he said, her name rough in his throat, "these past weeks, working with you, talking with you, it has been the first time since the war that I have felt like myself again. The first time I have felt anything but emptiness. You did that. Not the building, not the town. You." Eleanor's eyes widened. "Jacob, I'm not good with words. I do not know how to say what I'm feeling, but I think I need to try, because if I ride back up that mountain without telling you, I will regret it for the rest of my life." "Then tell me," Eleanor whispered, stepping closer to him. Jacob took a deep breath. "I think I am falling in love with you." "No, I know I am. I have been fighting it for weeks, telling myself it was impossible, that I had nothing to offer you, that you deserved better than a haunted mountain man with blood on his hands. But the truth is, when I am with you, the ghosts are quieter. The world is brighter. You raised my spirits higher than any beam I have ever lifted, and I do not want to go back to that lonely mountain without you." Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks. "Jacob Thornwood, I have been in love with you since the first week we worked together. Watching you build, seeing the care and pride you took in every detail, learning the good and gentle heart hidden beneath your gruff exterior. I tried to tell myself it was foolish, that you would leave as soon as the school was done, and I would never see you again, but I could not stop my heart from hoping." Jacob reached up and cupped her face in his large calloused hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "I have no pretty words for you. I cannot offer you the life you knew in Boston, the society and culture and refinement. All I have is a half-finished cabin on a mountain, a few tools, and these hands that know how to build. But if you will have me, I swear I will spend the rest of my life building a home and a life worthy of you." I do not want Boston, Eleanor said fiercely. I do not want society or refinement. I want you, Jacob. I want to wake up in a cabin on a mountain and watch the sunrise with you. I want to teach in the school you built and come home to you every evening. I want to build a life with you, a real life full of purpose and meaning and love. Jacob bent his head and kissed her then, a kiss that held all the longing and hope and wonder that had been building between them for weeks. Eleanor melted against him, her arms wrapping around his neck. And for a long moment, they stood in the empty schoolhouse, two lonely souls who had found each other against all odds. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless and smiling. Jacob rested his forehead against Eleanor's and said, "Marry me. I know it is too soon. I know I should court you properly, but I am not a patient man when I finally know what I want. Marry me, Eleanor, and I will spend every day for the rest of our lives proving you made the right choice." "Yes," Eleanor said, laughing through fresh tears. "Yes, Jacob, I will marry you. Today, tomorrow, whenever you want. I am yours." They were married a week later in the little church, with half the town in attendance. Eleanor wore a simple white dress she had made herself, with wildflowers in her hair that Jacob had picked that morning. He wore new clothes purchased from the general store, and boots that actually fit properly for the first time in years. Thomas Thornwood arrived the day before the wedding, having ridden hard from Kansas when he received Jacob's telegram. He served as best man and spent the entire ceremony grinning like he had personally arranged the match. "I knew when I sent her to you that something good would come of it," Thomas told Jacob at the reception. "You needed someone to remind you how to live, and she needed someone to show her what strength and goodness really looked like. You are perfect for each other." "You are a meddling fool," Jacob said, but he clapped his brother on the shoulder with genuine affection. "And I owe you a debt I can never repay." After the celebration, Jacob and Eleanor rode up to the mountain cabin together. Eleanor sat before Jacob on his buckskin gelding, cradled safely in his arms, marveling at the forest that was now her home. When they arrived at the clearing, she gasped in delight at the half-finished cabin. "It is wonderful, Jacob, but how will we finish it before winter?" "We will finish it together," Jacob said, helping her down from the horse, "and it will not take long with 2 sets of hands. I have already cut most of the timber we need." They spent their wedding night in the tent under a canopy of stars, wrapped in each other's arms and making promises about the life they would build together. In the morning, they began work on the cabin. True to Jacob's word, with Eleanor helping, the remaining wall went up quickly. They raised the roof together, Eleanor holding beams steady while Jacob secured them, both of them laughing when they realized they made a perfect team. Over the next month, they finished the cabin completely. It was a beautiful structure, solid and well-crafted, with glass windows that Eleanor had ordered from Denver, and a stone fireplace that Jacob built with rocks from a nearby stream. They made furniture together, Eleanor learning woodworking under Jacob's patient instruction. They built a bed frame and a table and chairs and shelves for Eleanor's books. They hung curtains and laid rugs and made the cabin into a home. When winter came, they were ready. They had supplies laid in, firewood stacked high, and a cozy nest to weather the cold months together. Eleanor continued to teach at the school, riding down the mountain 3 days a week while Jacob worked on building furniture to sell in town. He discovered he enjoyed the work, the creative challenge of designing pieces that were both beautiful and functional. Word of his skills spread, and soon he had more commissions than he could fill. But the work never took precedence over Eleanor. She remained his first priority, his greatest joy. They would sit by the fire in the evenings, Eleanor reading aloud from her books while Jacob carved or sketched designs. They would talk for hours about everything and nothing, making up for all the years they had both spent in loneliness. They would make love with a passion that never diminished, Jacob worshiping Eleanor's body with the same care and reverence he brought to his carpentry. Spring came, and with it, news. Eleanor was pregnant. Jacob received the announcement with stunned joy, placing his large hand over her still flat belly and marveling at the life growing within. "A child," he whispered. "Our child." "Are you happy?" Eleanor asked, searching his face. "Happy does not begin to describe what I am feeling," Jacob said. "Grateful, blessed, terrified, but mostly overwhelmed with love for you and for this little one who is not even born yet." They prepared for the baby's arrival with the same teamwork that had built the cabin. Jacob constructed a beautiful cradle from cherry wood with intricate carvings of mountain flowers and animals. Eleanor sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands shaking with excitement as she imagined the small person who would wear them. They talked endlessly about names and what kind of parents they wanted to be, and how they would balance teaching and carpentry with raising a child. In late autumn of 1877, Eleanor gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The labor was long and difficult, with the midwife from town staying at the cabin for 2 days. Jacob paced the small space like a caged bear, feeling utterly helpless as Eleanor labored. But when he finally heard the baby's first cry, he broke down in tears of relief and joy. They named him Thomas William Thornwood, after Jacob's brother and Eleanor's father, who had eventually forgiven her for running off to the Wild West and had even sent a generous gift when he heard about the wedding. Little Thomas had his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes, and from the first moment Jacob held him, he was completely besotted. Fatherhood transformed Jacob in ways he had not expected. The gentleness that Eleanor had always seen in him, but that he had hidden from the world, now came fully to the surface. He would spend hours just watching Thomas sleep, marveling at the perfection of his tiny fingers and toes. He sang to him in a surprisingly good baritone, old German lullabies his grandfather had taught him. He built toys and carved animals and read stories in a patient voice that made Eleanor fall in love with him all over again. Eleanor returned to teaching when Thomas was 3 months old, bringing the baby with her to school. The students were enchanted with little Thomas, and the older girls helped care for him while Eleanor taught. Jacob would often ride down to meet them at the end of the school day, arriving with Thomas's favorite wooden horse or some small gift he had made. The townspeople watched the little family with warm approval, pleased to see the lonely mountain man so obviously happy and settled. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and small joys. Jacob built a workshop near the cabin and took on a young apprentice from town, a boy named Samuel, who showed real talent for woodworking. Together, they created beautiful pieces that were sold as far away as Denver and San Francisco. Jacob's furniture became known for its quality and craftsmanship, and though they were never wealthy, they were comfortable and secure. Eleanor continued teaching, watching with pride as her students grew and flourished. Some went on to higher education, something that would have been impossible without the school. Others became skilled tradespeople or successful ranchers. All carried with them the love of learning that Eleanor had instilled, and many came back years later to thank her for changing their lives. When Thomas was 3, Eleanor became pregnant again. This time, she carried twins, a fact that was discovered only when the midwife delivered a healthy baby girl, and then announced there was another one coming. Jacob nearly fainted when the second baby, another girl, was born 10 minutes after her sister. They named the twins Sarah and Rebecca, and suddenly the cabin was filled with noise and chaos and laughter. Thomas took his role as big brother seriously, helping to watch over his sisters and bringing them toys when they cried. Jacob built an addition onto the cabin to accommodate the growing family, and Eleanor scaled back her teaching to 2 days a week so she could spend more time at home. Life was full and busy and sometimes exhausting, but neither Jacob nor Eleanor would have changed a moment of it. They had found something precious and rare in each other and in the life they had built together. Love, purpose, family, community, all the things Jacob had thought lost to him forever, had been restored through Eleanor's determination and faith. On their 5th wedding anniversary, they stood together on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. Thomas was playing with wooden blocks on the floor behind them, and the twins were asleep in the cradle Jacob had expanded to fit them both. Eleanor leaned back against Jacob's broad chest, his arms wrapped securely around her, and sighed with contentment. "Do you ever regret coming down from this mountain?" she asked softly. "Do you ever wish you had stayed alone?" Jacob pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Not for a single moment. You gave me my life back, Eleanor. You reminded me that I was more than my worst memories, that I could build and create and love. I was just existing up here before you came, surviving but not living. You changed everything." "You changed everything for me too," Eleanor said, turning in his arms to face him. I came west looking for purpose and found that and so much more. I found a partner, a love, a life beyond anything I could have imagined. You are my home, Jacob Thornwood, wherever we are. And you are mine, Jacob said, kissing her deeply. You raised my spirits higher than any beam I ever lifted, and you keep raising them every single day. Years continued to pass in their mountain home. They watched their children grow into strong, intelligent young people who carried the best qualities of both parents. Thomas developed his father's skill with tools and his mother's love of learning, eventually becoming a teacher himself in a school 2 towns over. Sarah became a doctor, inspired by the midwife who had delivered her and her twin, and opened a practice in Silver Ridge. Rebecca married a rancher and had 4 children of her own, filling Jacob and Eleanor's later years with grandchildren to spoil. Jacob continued building, though as he aged he focused more on teaching than doing. He trained a dozen young men in the craft of fine carpentry, passing on the skills his grandfather had taught him. His furniture graced homes throughout Colorado, and several pieces he built for the state capitol building in Denver were considered masterpieces of frontier craftsmanship. Eleanor taught until she was 60, retiring only when her eyesight began to fail. But she remained involved with the school, serving on the board and establishing a scholarship fund for students who wanted to pursue higher education. The school building Jacob had built stood strong and true for over 40 years before being replaced with a larger structure to accommodate Silver Ridge's growth. But even then, the old school was not torn down. It was converted into a library and community center, a lasting testament to the mountain man who had come down from his solitude to build something meaningful. On their 40th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the mountain cabin for a celebration. The cabin had been expanded and improved over the years, but it retained its essential character, the beauty of Jacob's original craftsmanship, still evident in every beam and joint. Jacob was 70 now, his dark hair gone silver and his face lined with age, but his arms were still strong and his hands still steady. Eleanor was 66, her auburn hair faded to a soft gray and her green eyes bright behind spectacles, still as beautiful to Jacob as the day he had first seen her ride into his clearing. They stood together on the porch, surrounded by their family, and Jacob raised a glass. 40 years ago, a stubborn woman from Boston rode up my mountain and refused to take no for an answer. She disrupted my solitude, challenged my assumptions, and reminded me how to live. She raised my spirits higher than any beam I ever lifted, and she has kept them raised for 4 decades. Eleanor Thornwood, you are the greatest blessing of my life, and I thank God every day that you were foolish enough to marry a broken mountain man. Eleanor laughed, her eyes shining with tears. You were never broken, Jacob. You were healing, and you just needed someone to see the man you truly were beneath the wounds. Building that school together, building this life together, has been the greatest adventure I could have imagined. You are my partner, my love, my home. Here is to 40 more years. Hear, hear, their children chorused, and the celebration continued late into the night. Jacob and Eleanor did not get 40 more years, but they got 12 good ones. Jacob passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, with Eleanor holding his hand and all their children gathered around. His last words were, I love you, Eleanor. Thank you for everything. Eleanor followed him 2 years later, her heart simply giving out as she sat reading in the chair by the window that overlooked the mountains. She was found with a smile on her face and a book open in her lap, and those who knew her said she had simply gone to be with Jacob, unable to bear being separated from him any longer. They were buried side by side in the Silver Ridge Cemetery under a simple stone that read, Jacob and Eleanor Thornwood, builder and teacher, beloved by all, together forever. The school Jacob had built still stood, converted now to the Eleanor Thornwood Community Library. And in the workshop behind the cabin, Jacob's tools were carefully maintained by his grandson, who was teaching his own children the craft of fine woodworking, passing on the skills and the values that Jacob had held dear. The story of the mountain man and the Boston schoolteacher became legend in Silver Ridge, told and retold to new generations. It was a story about the power of love to heal wounded souls, about the importance of building things that last, about 2 people who found each other against impossible odds and created a life of purpose and meaning together. It was a story about how one person's determination and faith could lift another person's spirits higher than they had ever thought possible. And in the mountains above Silver Ridge, the cabin still stood, maintained now by the Thornwood Family Trust as a memorial and occasional retreat. Visitors who hiked up to see it would stand on the porch and marvel at the craftsmanship, at the solid beams and tight joints that had weathered decades of mountain storms without failing. They would read the plaque by the door that told the story of Jacob and Eleanor, and they would understand that this cabin represented more than shelter. It represented love and hope and the indomitable human spirit. It represented two people who had been alone and lonely, who had found each other and built something beautiful that would endure long after they were gone. The mountains endured, as they always had, and always would. But now they held within their embrace not just stone and timber and rushing streams, but also the memory of a great love story. A story of a man who had thought himself beyond redemption and a woman who had seen his true worth. A story of a school built in 6 weeks that changed a town forever. A story of a mountain man who learned that the strongest thing he could build was not a cabin or a school, but a life shared with the person he loved. Jacob Thornwood had come to the mountains to die slowly of loneliness, but instead, he had learned to live fully in love. Eleanor Hartwell had come west to make a difference, and she had transformed not just a town, but one man's heart and soul. Together they had built a legacy that extended far beyond timber and stone. They had built a family, a community, and a love story that would be remembered and celebrated for generations. The beams Jacob had hewn with his own hands still supported the roof of the library in Silver Ridge. The desks he had crafted still served students in various schools throughout Colorado. His furniture graced museums and historical societies. But his greatest creation was not made of wood or stone. It was the life he and Eleanor had built together, filled with love and laughter and purpose. And if you stood very quietly in the cabin on the mountain at sunset, when the light turned the world golden and the wind whispered through the pines, you could almost hear them. Jacob's deep voice and Eleanor's lighter one, talking and laughing as they had done for 42 years, building something together as they always had. Two souls who had found each other in the wilderness and created something that would last forever. The story of the mountain man who hewed beams and raised a roof alone until she came along and raised his spirits higher than any beam was more than just a tale of frontier romance. It was a testament to the power of love to heal, to transform, to give meaning to lives that had lost their way. It was proof that sometimes the strongest structures are not the ones built of timber and stone, but the ones built of trust and partnership and devotion. Jacob and Eleanor's story lived on in the hearts and memories of everyone they had touched. In the students Eleanor had taught who went on to teach others. In the craftsmen Jacob had trained who passed on his skills. In their children and grandchildren who carried their values forward into new generations. In the buildings Jacob had constructed that still stood strong and true, sheltering families and communities. And in the mountains themselves, eternal and unchanging, where two people had found each other and built a love that would last beyond their mortal years. The mountains had witnessed their meeting, their courtship, their marriage, their family, and their final rest. And the mountains, as they always did, kept their secrets and their stories safe, whispering them to anyone who took the time to listen. The cabin on the mountain stood as it always had, solid and beautiful, a monument to craftsmanship and to love. And somewhere in the golden light of sunset, or the silver glow of moonrise, if you believed in such things, you might catch a glimpse of two figures standing on the porch, hand in hand, looking out over the valleys and peaks that had been their home. The mountain man and his teacher, the builder and the believer, Jacob and Eleanor, together forever in the place they had loved most, having built not just a cabin or a school or a family, but a love story for the ages.